This is a modern marvel. It's a $10 hammer, and even though modern-day manufacturing has simplified the construction of tools like hammers and knives, there are people devoted to unpacking and preserving the sometimes lost and far from obsolete techniques that were used in the olden days. Blacksmith Jim Austin is obsessed with Viking axes, and specifically making them exactly how they would have been made hundreds of years ago. Let's head to his Oakland shop while he constructs a Viking battle axe.
My name is Jim Austin, and I've been a blacksmith for going on 40 years. Over the last 20 years, I've built up a shop in West Oakland, and I have a very special interest for woodworking tools that are forged by blacksmiths in Northern Europe. And for about the last 10 years, I've involved myself a lot in forging axes. What we'll be doing here today is forging a Viking battle axe out of a simple piece of soft steel. This is marked out and then taken through a series of interesting forging steps, and it'll give us an axe approximately like this, but a little smaller. This is an axe that a Viking warrior might have carried in about the year 900. The process is historical enough that I think the Vikings would have recognized all the steps that we're going to go through. And yet, for the modern eye, they're very unusual. The eye of the axe is actually formed by forging the cross-section of the axe with a void in it that will give the eye when these two halves are folded together. When they come together, they're welded, and that's a process that'll take place at white-hot temperatures, and the sides are forged together, and they become one. The front of the axe will be spread out into a wider blade, which is of course thinner. And then this part of the blade will be fitted with a piece of high carbon steel, which will give a great cutting edge, something like this. After that, the blade will be forged thinner and wider and ground to a sharp edge. It'll be hardened and tempered, and it'll be ready for use then.
So I've got these marks on each side of the piece. They tell me where to set tools on it, and John will be striking for me. He's an excellent striker, excellent smith actually. And we'll be forming this piece of steel with tools called fullers.
Okay.
Just marking?
Yeah. Okay. I like to work with a striker whenever possible in making an axe. Power hammers can do a lot, but strikers can do more. They don't have as much strength as a power hammer, but if you have a smith who will act as your striker, the ideal striker being somebody with as much knowledge as you about what you're making, then you can get the work done with a minimum of effort, a minimum of mistakes, and use all kinds of striking techniques that you couldn't do by hand, and you couldn't do on a power hammer because power hammers always come straight down. A striker can hit to the side, he can listen to you, you can adjust the strength of his blows, and if you've been making the same piece for a while, you almost don't need to talk. You know, he knows when you set a tool in a certain place, you need a certain kind of hit.
But let's give it a little bit more cross-fullering for width. Okay, so the next step is to actually make these two surfaces that come together, this surface and this surface, ready for welding. Right now they're all crusty black, They have a surface texture that could trap oxides that would make the weld maybe fail. So what we need to do is get them really pure and clean in a blacksmithing sense for sticking together. You should be able to see that the scale is releasing from the surface. When it turns dark, it's no longer stuck to the metal. So that is a relatively scale-free surface, but it's got oxide on it. I'm going to dissolve the oxide by just putting a little tiny bit of borax on it. You can see it melt as soon as it hits the surface. This is anhydrous borax. What we've done is we've gone from this initial starting piece, which has center punch marks that guide the tools, and we've done a bunch of different what we call fullering or spreading operations to attain this shape here. And this is what's going to get folded to go forward with the axe procedure. Basically, the strategy is to use this somewhat of a grooving tool, I guess you could think of it as, to punch down grooves into the starting piece that separate the back of the axe from the cheeks, that's the sides of the eye, and the blade material. So once we've divided those sections with that tool, we use this fuller to spread them up and down to give these features here. So we're using this fuller inside the eye, on the edge of the anvil, to cause this material to spread high and low. In the same process, it pushes the back of the axe downward on the next to the edge of the anvil and forms a thickened back on the axe. So basically, when we take these two pieces and fold them forward, we'll have a gap in the middle that'll form the eye. We'll have a thick back on the axe, and these two slabs of steel will add up to form the blade of the axe. One thing that's quite different about Viking era axe making is that the axes were made by hand. Now today, if you want to make a hole in an axe, which is the hardest part of the axe making process traditionally, you'd simply on a machine take a square billet of steel and punch a chisel, and you would have an eye, and boom, you have an axe. Earlier axes, they clearly had to go through the process of folding the axe because they didn't have a steel that could punch through a billet of cutting-edge steel. That was simply impossible for them to do. So they had a strategy that grew out of their lack of resources, in a sense, and they were incredibly good at leveraging what means they did have to produce, the axe that they wanted to make. It's a real testament to how brilliant they were at their work. So this is a relatively good closure on the eye. These corners, or the edges came together, shoulders. The back is pretty symmetrical on there. The eye, the cheeks look relatively the same thickness and length, so that should weld together and give an eye that's a winner. I got started being a blacksmith when I kind of gave up on chemistry as a career that I thought would work out very well for me. I was doing really well all through school in San Jose State and in Berkeley in the graduate department in chemistry, and I just couldn't take it, so I ended up getting an apprenticeship in southern Germany, down in Bavaria. It was just the most unusual thing to happen, but I decided to go for it. I learned German over the summer at the intensive class, and a few months later I was an apprentice in Germany, earning $1 an hour, but living the life I kind of always thought would be interesting. So I would say this is about a finished, forged eye. We've got a nice outer form. The hole fits 100% on the mandrel, so that's always desirable. Now we can look at spreading the blade wide. So we formed the back of the axe. We've got the langet profile. We've got the hole set up the way we want it. But the blade is, at this point, is just a block of steel, soft steel. It'll be necessary to put in a bit of high carbon steel to make a finished axe that's capable of cutting anything. So the strategy will be to put a piece of high carbon steel into the body of the metal by slitting it and then hammering the slit so that it accepts the high carbon bit. That process starts, in my shop anyways, by cutting a slot into the body here with a bandsaw and then forming that slot out as the blade widens and thins into the cleft for the high carbon bit. So there's the slot, cut approximately equally deep on both sides. And this will now go to the forge for hammering the blade out into a shape more like this.
I regard axe making in my shop as a form of research. Since I have actually a scientific background, I like to study what I do and proceed with a lot of intention based on the most recent things I've done, to learn a process. And that means I keep notebooks on what I do. And the natural kind of outgrowth of this is that with those notes and studying processes really methodically, I'm able to teach them. And when I teach the processes, I actually solidify the knowledge in myself a lot better because I have to organize it in my head to make somebody else understand that. So that's a really big part of what I do, is offer classes in anything from, Viking armoring, forging, to knife making, to axe making.
We're going to open the edge of the axe up, which has a slot in it but is closed, with a chisel into a wedge-shaped opening. And the bit, which has a wedge shape, will fit directly into it like this. The wedge is formed from a rectangular bar of high carbon steel, simply by pinching the edge out thin. So, the forging is done on that axe. The last step is a normalization to chill the metal out, to relax the structure of all this forged steel. That just cools down, and we'll take it up again tomorrow with the grinding, heat treating, and the polishing. So now that the axe is cooled down, we can take our first really good look at the piece up close to see how all of the forging went. It looks like the forging went really well on this piece. We know that there's a seam coming down the middle of the blade, but it's just barely visible, which means that as the forging went on, it just disappeared, basically, blended into the work. So the steel is wedged into the front of the axe, but the seam here is also completely invisible, which is a good sign. What I've got right now are the bunch of little lumps and bumps in the shape that it's a lot faster to grind out than to go after endlessly with a hammer. So basically, I will start the grinding by establishing the front curve of the axe, because all of the lines lead up to that, and this is by any means the most important curve of the whole piece. I do take a special pride in getting certain relationships between all of the curves on this piece, though, so I'll be looking at it very carefully when I grind it.
What I find really striking about handmade historical axes is, for one thing, how well made they were. Let's say Norwegian or Swedish Viking era axe was actually quite beautiful. They were finished so well. The proportions are stunningly modern, I would say, in some cases. Basically, what you notice in a Viking axe is they didn't let any seam show in the finished piece, even though it had nothing to do with the quality of the piece, how well it could be used as a woodworking axe. They did very fine workmanship. They obviously took pride in that. And that's something that just resonates with me as a craftsman.
So we have a nice hard edge there. We also have a really oily axe, so I'm gonna take the oil off of it and put it in a tempering oven at 440 degrees Fahrenheit to give it a nicely tempered edge that's not brittle. At this point, the steel in the edge here is hard as glass and about as brittle as glass. If I were to drop this, it might chip a big piece out of the edge. The idea now is to get it very quickly into the tempering oven. So now the axe has been tempered. It's at about 440 degrees. Let that cool down a little bit. And I'll begin the polishing of the edge. So here's the finished axe. The edge has been hardened, tempered twice, and it is ready for sharpening. That's what I ask the customer to do because I tend to cut myself if I sharpen these things fully. You've seen the process go from a rectangular bar of steel through a pretty complex and unexpected, for most people anyways, unexpected process to get to a finished axe. In my eyes, there's a lot of beauty in an axe. It's been completely made by hand. There's traces of a lot of the kinds of work that were done on it, in the textures and the hammer blows. If I see an old axe like this as a blacksmith, I look over the surface for traces of what the blacksmith did, because I feel like it's kind of a dialogue between me and a traditional guy from who knows how long ago. Well, thanks for following this process. It's something that not a lot of people get a chance to delve into. If you would like to learn more about axes that I make, woodworking axes of Scandinavia, you can check out my website at forgedaxes.com or alchemymetalworks.org. And if you want to learn how to make this exact axe, it's the Viking axe that I teach in my classes in West Oakland.